On today's World Insight, the drawdown of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, the impact on the nation's security and the region as a whole, for better or for worse. And allegations of the Danish Foreign Secret Service aiding U.S. spying on European allies, a small irritant on relations, or there's more than meets the eye.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. I'm Tian Wei. The U.S. military is almost halfway in pulling out all its forces from Afghanistan, according to the U.S. Central Command, with the U.S. presence already cut down to around 3,500 from more than 100,000 under previous administrations. Complete withdrawal could go well ahead of the September 11th deadline, which is the 20th anniversary of the 2001 9/11 attack. Spanning 4 presidencies and also Afghanistan is the U.S. longest war. But when the U.S. forces are out, Afghanistan is still left divided, with Afghan forces and Taliban militants controlling different areas.
A Taliban patrol in sight. It's time for the ambush to begin. Afghan soldiers sweep past the dead looking for prisoners of war. All goes well because it's a training exercise to prepare these young men for the real thing, which they will face soon. Patriotism and poverty ensure there are always fresh recruits.
While the Taliban and its shadow government have made gains across the countryside, the Afghan army has consolidated its control over all urban areas.
With neither side seemingly capable of an outright military victory, and the US in retreat, a peace deal seems inevitable. Already the government and Taliban are talking about a system similar to Iran's, involving a leadership council above an elected body. It's a worrying direction for many Afghan women. A Taliban-led council would likely ban female education, just for starters. Violence is expected to escalate as both sides seek a stronger hand at the negotiating table. Which means, until a deal is done, there will only be more heartbreak in a country that has already endured 4 decades of brutal war. Jack Barton, CGTN, Kabul.
Four decades of chaos already in Afghanistan. For more on U.S. troops withdrawal from Afghanistan, we are joined in Beijing, Li Guofu, Director of the Center for Middle East Studies with China Institute of International Studies. In Boston, Jim Walsh, Senior Research Associate at MIT's Security Studies Program. Last but certainly not least, in Kabul, Mushtaq Rahim, Independent Political and Security Analyst in Afghanistan, and he's joining us standing in the wild, in fact, with a big wind. Thank you so much, Mr. Rahim, for supporting this conversation. I want to start with you. What exactly is the situation on the ground regarding U.S. troops withdrawal from Afghanistan, your country?
Well, basically, one can see that there has been significant spike in the Taliban attacks in the rural areas. What they have been doing, they accumulate all of their force to a certain geographical point, and then they start their ambush against the military checkpoints and military installations. They begin with Helmand province in the south, then they targeted eastern province of Laghman more recently, and since a couple of days we have been hearing news coming out from the Shinwar area, an area that is part of the eastern province, Nangarhar. So what they have been doing, they have been accumulating, bringing all their forces together, targeting one area to take it over, and then the military forces come in and then they push them out of the area. But in the meantime, they've been able to make new splashes breaking news coming out of those areas, sending a message of concern among the general public, which has been the course of action by the Taliban and the situation in Afghanistan.
I see. Mr. Walsh, according to the latest report coming from the U.S., 46% or so withdrawal of U.S. troops in Afghanistan. Earlier, more than 100,000. Now it's much less. What do you think about the process vis-a-vis what Mr. Rahim just briefed us?
Well, I think we have to be realistic here. If you look at the UN monitoring report that was released yesterday, it gave a description of the facts on the ground. I think the facts on the ground are that as it stands before the withdrawal, the Afghan government forces are sort of more or less at a draw. You know, they control certain areas, the Taliban controls certain areas, but they've had the benefit of U.S. air power to protect them when they've done that. And when those troops and Europeans are gone, I think it's going to be a more difficult fight. And the Taliban obviously believes, whether it's right or wrong, it believes it will have the upper hand in the long term, and whether through negotiation or force will be able to prevail. Again, we don't know that. Some forces in Afghanistan are very good. You know, the commando forces are very good. Some, like the National Police, not so good.
Yeah.
And so I think it's going to be tough sledding for the Afghan government. I think everyone in the U.S. and around the world probably thinks that this is going to be tough on them.
There's always a complicated relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and of course what the government in Kabul are likely to do. As we know, it's pretty much the government functioning on its own in a way with limited power all over the country. So, Mr. Rahim, would you like to help us understand the situation on the ground once again regarding these three very different identities, the Taliban, the Al-Qaeda, and also the government? Mr. Rahim. It seems that we're having...
Can you come again? I couldn't hear it well.
Okay, I know that you have big wind on the ground there. So let me ask very briefly, three factors inside Afghanistan, your country, the government in Kabul, the Taliban, and the Al-Qaeda. Now, to you, what is the real division of power and capacity?
You know, Al-Qaeda was very much eliminated, and they don't possess the required military power that is required to challenge the government establishment and government apparatus. But they have the financial resources, but more than that is the moral support that they offer to the Taliban or certain elements within the Taliban. It is mainly between the Afghan government and the Taliban, you know, and in that, Taliban have been penetrating the rural communities, and out of that they have been operating and challenging the government. Now, since they have been operating from inside the communities, it's really difficult for the Afghan government to really go all out in their attack and clearance operations because there is always chance of collateral damage, and because of that they get curtailed and contained in their operations. Now what's going on is that the Taliban have been trying to tire the national forces, make them wary, and that's what they are doing. Otherwise, I think the Afghan forces have been holding up to the challenge of the Taliban since 2014, when the American forces and international forces withdrew from the combat mission and engaged in mainly an advisory role. So they have been fighting them. But then the issue, as I mentioned, is operation within the communities, where the Afghan forces have to make sure that there is no civilian casualties, and that is time consuming, energy consuming, and also makes it difficult for them to have an all-out operation on the ground.
Mr. Lee, you've been watching very closely the situation in Afghanistan over the years. Let me ask you if you could look at the camera, if possible. The Taliban used to have very good public support inside Afghanistan. They're almost like, some suggest, the guerrillas inside the country. Now, of course, as time passes by, things are changing in Afghanistan. But what exactly do you think about the level of support from the public in terms of the Taliban or the government forces? By the way, of course, as usually the logic goes, whoever has the gun has the control, but the public sentiment is still a very important factor.
I think it would be very hard to say the real percentage of the people,
Yeah.
and given to each of these functions. It depends on the areas. For those areas has been a long time controlled by Taliban, they have received the most of the support from the local people. And for those has been a long time controlled and managed by the government's forces. And they also have received the most of the support from the public. But generally speaking, the people would believe that among some areas, especially these rural areas, the support for the Taliban would be higher than the support to the governments, and especially in those areas, for example, the mountain areas. So, and we think about if the Americans completely withdraw from the Afghanistan, then I think the two forces, at least for the time being, it seems like equal. And it'll be very hard to say which side is has the upper hand over the other side.
Mr. Walsh, it's no secret that the various administrations have been talking about withdrawing from Afghanistan, but it has been a very difficult process. Now, we understand there is a deadline, September 11th, 20th anniversary, but it's not a deadline about when Afghanistan is really getting into shape. It's a deadline about what Americans want in terms of its own time schedule of withdrawing from Afghanistan. Mr. Walsh, what do you make of this decision and the nature of decision by various administrations and this administration particularly?
Well, I think it's inevitable. I don't hear many people in the U.S. or in the international community saying that the U.S. should stay in Afghanistan forever. So if it's not going to be forever, when is it that the U.S. is going to leave? And I think it's a wise decision. But it's been politically fraught. There are some truisms in international politics. One is it's easier to get in a war than to get out of a war. Another is that it's easier to break something up than to build it. And we've seen both things true in Afghanistan. So I think the U.S. would have loved to have left years ago, but as a matter of domestic politics, that was very difficult. And then in some ways, I had a lot of disagreements with President Trump. We could devote a show to that. But one of the things he did is he cleared the political way. He cleared the political path for his successor, Joe Biden, to come in and simply agree to what Trump had already done, which is announce a withdrawal, rather than having to be the one to announce it himself. And so I think the combination of that transition made it politically easier for the U.S. to do what it was hoping to do for some years now.
Of course, the Afghan issue is not just about Afghanistan itself or about the U.S. Willingness of actions in Afghanistan, but also the international community, particularly neighboring countries. Now, China recently have been working on the negotiations and the peace process in Afghanistan. Recently, the Chinese foreign minister, state counselor also worked with the BRICS foreign ministers to talk about the situation in Afghanistan and focusing their concerted effort to see to peace about Afghanistan. But Mr. Li, what exactly is China's expectation, the world's expectation about Afghanistan, and also the role of the U.S. as China sees it?
I think the role of U.S. in Afghanistan, I think it is obviously, as our American friend had already said, the people, because America has engaged so long and had spent so much, had cost so many, the casualties, people's death, so people are tired. They need to leave Afghanistan long time ago, and if U.S. could not be orderly withdraw and hold a much responsibility to have a proper arrangement for its withdrawal. Then, American withdrawal would cause a lot of trouble.
Right. What is orderly to you?
I think the orderly, political arrangements, and to make sure that the once American leaves Afghanistan, that would be the source of escalation of war. Especially, people said it is very likely, maybe the current violence would be escalated into a more wider scale of civil war.
I see.
Now that's something people are very worried about.
And of course, it is not going to be a single case, because Afghanistan is playing a very important regional role over there where it is. Mr. Rahim, once again, I want to express my appreciation for your supporting us. You're standing in the wind. I can see the wind blowing over to your side. Thank you so much. To you, what do you make of this withdrawal, and particularly the international community's concern about peace and stability in Afghanistan, and China and some of the others' call for peace process inside Afghanistan?
There is no other way but the peace process to prevail in Afghanistan, and it's in the wider interest of the region and the world. We saw it in 2001 when 2 decades ago the warfare had not advanced to the level that we are seeing today with the modern technology. This means that any sort of instability will not stay within the borders of Afghanistan. It's going to harm the international interest and the regional interest. Now, Afghanistan is really counting, and so many of the politicians I've been talking to here in Kabul, count a lot on China and Russia, and to a certain extent on Iran, in a way that they need to contribute to the Afghan peace process. They have to support the Afghan government and support the peace process, and also influence those regional actors who have been trying to fuel the conflict in order to pursue their regional agenda. Otherwise, if the support doesn't come for the peace process, and the peace process does not prevail, there is every opportunity that Afghanistan may slip further into violence, and the country may turn once more as a sanctuary for those non-state actors who would have military ambitions in the region at least, and those elements could be used by outsiders for pursuing their regional agenda.
Right.
That's why the Afghan government believes, and the politicians here we have been talking to, particularly former President Hamid Karzai, I met him a couple of weeks ago, they believe that China and Russia have to come forward and make sure that we have a region that is stabilized, which is promising to achieve its ultimate potential in terms of economic, social, and political development in the 21st century.
Mr. Rahim, I talked to the former president myself in some previous interviews. It's very clear he talked about the earlier history of Afghanistan. They have become a battleground of proxy wars between some of the world's powers of that time, and that was a sad and a very tragic experience for Afghanistan. Unfortunately, its legacy is still lingering today. Mr. Li Guofu in Beijing, tell me more about what does China make of the call coming from Afghanistan? What role will China play, and how is China seeing Afghanistan's earlier history of being a battleground of proxy wars of world powers then during the Cold War?
I think and China is a good neighboring of Afghanistan. We are very much concerned about the situation in Afghanistan, and as a good neighbor. And we have already, the Foreign Minister Wang Yi offer, the China could be places, and since we have a good working relations with both parties, we invited them to come to China and to talk and to find out, the proper arrangement for peaceful solving the issues, and we strongly believe only the political or peaceful solution is the right, or is the only solution to solving the Afghanistan issue.
I see. Before we go, I want to do a final round. Everyone maybe give some brief answers. Now, things are changing. When we talk about the proxy war, that was during the Cold War time, and then there's lingering effect until 9/11. Then things happened differently, and then war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Afghanistan didn't have peace for a long time until today. The U.S. troops withdraw. No certain fate for Afghanistan. But the one I'm talking about now is there's another likely to be a dramatic round of geopolitical changes in the region and beyond. China and the United States are becoming the largest powers in the world, and the two are not on good terms if we're looking at today. Mr. Walsh, what do you make of the issue of Afghanistan? If you look at the history and you look at the realities now of geopolitics, very briefly from you.
Yeah, we have referenced many times big players interfering in the internal politics. I think that's shifted. The U.S. and China have so many issues in its bilateral relationship. I don't think Afghanistan is going to make, the top 20 of all the things that they have to work out.
But
What's really going to drive this, I think, is
unfortunately.
Yeah, it will be, but it won't. It's just not going to rise to the level, given, I could list 10 things that are going to get more news play. The thing I want to emphasize, though, this isn't going to be a battleground where the U.S. is trying to pull strings and manipulate stuff. It wants to be done with Afghanistan. What we haven't talked about is Pakistan. There are local actors on the ground, not 1,000 miles, not 50,000 miles, half a planet away. Okay. Local actors on the ground who have interests in the future, and Pakistan is number one in both capacity and interest, its own national interest. What it decides to do here will determine the outcome, probably more than anything else. Pakistan will determine the outcome here, and the Afghan government.
20 seconds for the other two guests each. Mr. Rahim. Mr. Rahim, same question. Seems like he has.
Yeah, this is a concern. This is a concern. I'm sorry, because of wind I can't hear it well. That's why I'm delayed. As far as the proxy war is concerned, right now Afghanistan is seriously concerned with the interferences of Pakistan, which has been continuing for 4 decades. And then, of course, the worry that we may have other countries pursuing their agenda through non-state actors that may dismantle the balance of the ongoing conflict and may challenge the stability of Afghanistan. There are serious concerns, and I think the countries will have to come together and agree on rules of the game for Afghanistan for the better interest of the region and wider region. What I'm seeing right now.
20 seconds almost for Mr. Li Guofu, please.
I think, peace and stability in Afghanistan is in everyone's interests. So let's all together to work for it.
Let's all. Who are you referring to?
I think, the whole international communities and China, including the United States, and also its neighboring countries.
All right, Li Guofu, Mushtaq Rahim, Jim Walsh, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us, particularly Mr. Rahim for supporting us even in the big wind inside your country in Afghanistan. Thank you. Really appreciate it. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing. Coming up, allegations of the Danish Foreign Secret Service aiding U.S. spying on European allies, a small irritant on relations, or there's more than meets the eye. That's up for discussion next. Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Now let's turn to relations between the European Union and the U.S. Over the weekend, the Danish media reported Denmark's Foreign Secret Service helped the U.S. National Security Agency spy on European leaders. The alleged spying involved the U.S. access to Danish underwater internet cables that included searches, chats, messaging services used by high-ranking officials from Germany, France, Sweden, Norway. German Chancellor Angela Merkel is one of the leaders allegedly targeted. The accusations covered the years 2012 to 2014. Germany and France sought clarity from their allies. For its part, Denmark insisted there is, quote, no need to repair, quote, ties with its European neighbors. And the U.S. tried to dodge the bullet, saying it's eager to work with its European partners. Let's listen to what the French president had to say.
I'm attached to the bonds of trust that unite Europeans and Americans. So in this respect, we have everything to do for our common security, and there is no room for suspicion between us. That is why we expect complete clarity, and we've asked our Danish and American partners to provide all the information on these revelations and on past events.
On these spying allegations, we are joined in Washington, D.C., James Lewis, the Senior Vice President and Director of the Strategic Technology Program with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In Berlin, via Skype, Matteo Ragavoglia, a research associate at the Center for International Studies with the Department of Politics and International Relations, University of Oxford. In Beijing, last but not least, Cui Hongjian, Director of the European Studies Department at the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. James, what happened?
What happened is someone's trying to torpedo the summit. That's why they made this leak. It's old news. It's from 2014. So we have to ask, what are the political motives? And I don't know. Usually this is something the Russians would do, but it's an effort to torpedo the summit by leaking this kind of information.
Okay.
A political move, we'll see.
We'll see. Interesting. But one of the most important thing is whether somebody played with the timing or not, whether it happened or not. That's probably the most important thing. Matteo, your take.
Yes, but in a way, I would argue this is no news. This is news for the general public, but not for people in the business. This is something that has always been happening. Allies do spy on each other, and there's always an element of mistrust between intelligence agencies. It is just a matter of degrees. Western intelligence agencies mistrust each other to a limited extent on specific issues, and distrust other intelligence agencies much more and across the board. There's nothing new, so I do agree that what is interesting is not what has been going on, because it goes on all the time, but rather the timing of why and when these allegations came up.
I understand the intention to brush off the importance of this news, but it's really interesting as to these kind of news coming out into the public. We saw that earlier with some of the interesting things going on in Europe regarding some independent journalists inside the countries. But recently, this is one of the biggest one. So Matteo, you could argue that all countries spy on one another, but to such a level, to the president, the chancellor of Germany, and also to such an extent, and particularly not about the Danish directly on Germany, but rather helping the U.S. to spying on Germany. All these are very interesting twists and turns. One can't brush it off, just like that. Matteo.
I'm not brushing them all, but Europeans face three problems at the same time. First of all, they have supremely inferior intelligence capabilities compared to the Americans. Secondly, the United States government, rightly so in my view, applies what is a divided et impera approach, dealing with national governments on a bilateral basis, which gives the United States much more leverage. And Europeans have both diverging interests and perceptions in terms of security threats. So they are playing from a position of weakness, and they have an interest to build a strong bilateral relationship with the United States, and the United States does that extremely well.
So, Mr. Cui, it seems that what Matteo suggests is, well, the Europeans are vulnerable vis-a-vis the U.S. capabilities. So just let it be? What do you make of this recent incident?
I think this incident make me, could help to, call back the Prism Gate, I mean, several years ago. But of course, this time a very different thing is the role of Denmark played as a, the member of the European Union and also the member of the NATO. So I think this time, yes, to some degree, it's I think the continuing happening for this relations between U.S. and its European allies. But I think now this time we can find out the reactions from European countries. But I think now the key question, just like from President Macron, yes, it happened in the past, but how about the practice now? Especially, yes, I agree with the gentleman mentioned that a kind of political move in the background of the summit forthcoming between U.S. and the EU. But now the question is, how could the European side to be part of this kind of supremacy of, I mean, on the American leader, especially once the Biden administration showed a lot of the posture to repair and reshape the transatlantic relations.
Interesting. Matteo, I want to come back to you on that.
I have to say, I'm not, again, I'm not particularly surprised by any of these, other than the timing, which I think is the most interesting issue, because the Americans have been.
I'm not asking you whether you are surprised or not. I'm asking you maybe to respond to Mr. Cui's question, because you already said you are not surprised, and you don't have to repeat yourself, sir, if I could. Could you respond to the other guests' points, which is, it's very interesting, the French president already made his remarks, and also the German chancellor also made her attitude known as well. So what does that say about the Europe's capability as a whole vis-a-vis its shaping its relationship with the United States?
Not much, because this is for the benefit of public opinion. Heads of states, prime ministers, national governments have to rightly say that this is unacceptable and this is what has to be said to the public. And then we'll go back to business as usual within a matter of a few days. So in that respect, that is for public consumption. Within the intelligence community, this is a non-issue.
But the issue is, it is not just within the intelligence community this time. In this case, it is much beyond. It is going to the national politics and also the relations across the Atlantic. James, please come in about how the U.S. is likely to repair, or is there a necessity to repair in this regard?
There's 3 points that we should bear in mind when it comes to repairing the transatlantic relationship. The first is this activity ended years ago because it wasn't that useful. I mean, seeing what people are having for breakfast provides no intelligence value. Second, there's a deep network of cooperation between the United States and its European allies. So Denmark is not the only country that has cooperative relationships. Germany, for example, and France have cooperative intelligence relations with the U.S. And the revelations from Mr. Snowden did some damage.
Against a third European country?
You know, they cooperate on all the intelligence matters. The ones that are of most concern to them are terrorism, of course, proliferation, always a problem, and most interestingly, because I've talked to a number of European officials from different countries, the biggest problem they see is Russia. And when you look at the poisonings in the UK, the bombings in Czechoslovakia, the recent incident in Belarus involving
but James,
aircraft.
It is no secret that the Europeans are working with the Americans in the intelligence area toward Russia. But what I'm asking is that whether the Europeans are working, for example, the France and Germany are working with the United States to spy on a third European country, just as what Denmark did toward Germany and France?
You know, we're just not going to be able to get into that. I mean, there's a network of intelligence relationships. The primary targets are Russia,
that
China.
They did, right? Or we can assume that they did.
We can assume that countries do what they need to do. I think in many cases, the French and the Germans have spied on other European countries. not necessarily in cooperation with the U.S., but for their own national interest. And of course, the Germans recently exposed this in their Bundestag hearing. So it's a fairly common practice. The big concern they have, number one concern, is Russia and its increasingly erratic behavior.
We understand that there is a very clear message coming from both sides across the Atlantic about Russia, and also increasingly it is also about China to a certain extent. But that is not the issue today. The issue is more about cross-Atlantic relationship, and whether that is in real nature has been repaired after 4 years of the Trump administration, which we knew has been making some very big drama across the Atlantic. So on that point, I want to come back to you, Mr. Cui, observing as a third party. Of course, you're not either on the European side or on the US side, but rather observing as a third party. What do you make of the reality, particularly with this incident once again shining in the spotlight?
I think a lot very important thing regarding to this incident is, as we know, it's a little bit different from Prism Gate. Is at that time the people criticized the Bush administration, but this time, if you look at the timing, I mean, from it's right for this Obama administration. So it's indeed it's a point to Biden, Mr. Biden himself. So I think it's give a very big question to the honesty of Mr. Biden, for especially the popular opinion in Europe. I think the other very interesting issue is, Russia and some other so-called rivalry will be the target for this kind of intelligence sharing between U.S. and European countries.
Okay.
But now this time, the problem is target is not this Russia or some other, is right Germany, France. So it will give us a very big question for this kind of situation is how lack of this mutual trust between allies. I mean, for U.S. and the European countries, for example.
Got it.
Why there is a kind of situation? Because of United States doesn't trust any, allies, including Germany and France, and which kind of intelligence it want to get. Maybe the attitude or policy of Germany and France towards Russia, towards China, I'm not sure. So I think it gives a very big question is how could we define the concept of allies?
Okay, got it. James, would you like to respond to that question coming from Hong Jian in Beijing?
Yes, it was some good points he made, but I think that the Biden administration knows that it needs to repair the transatlantic relationship. There was immense damage done under the previous administration. Since the U.S. really does not spy on Europeans, there is no mass surveillance in Europe. That would be an easy concession to make to help rebuild trust. There's many issues, but I'd point to the reaction to the comprehensive agreement on investment between the EU and China. When that got to the European Parliament for ratification, there was a revolt, and it's on hold. So the political trends are moving in the right direction when it comes to the U.S. and its European allies. We agree on the same things, and the question now is, can the Biden administration turn that into concrete action that repairs the damage? I think they can.
To me, it's also interesting as a journalist to see whether only creating an enemy, for example, like China, that the U.S. is trying to do with its European allies, will be enough and sufficient to create this allyship that you once had before. Will that be this magic tool to repair everything, all the damages being done, and is still being done at this moment between the allies across the Atlantic? That to me is an interesting thing, not to mention the complicated relations China is having with European countries. They're individually and collectively, and the European Union as well. But these are very complicated matters. We might need another 1 or 2 hours to discuss. But I also want to check your temperature, Matteo, about that, about the allies. Will that having a third enemy be enough for allies to work together?
Having an enemy always helps to bring people together. Now, whether Europeans and Americans are creating an enemy out of China, that is something that you claim. In order for that claim would have to be.
I'm not claiming it. I'm just saying that is the intention coming from Washington. Washington is not making it a secret. In various documents, it's clearly being clarified. In the U.S. Congress, it's being said every day in the documents as well. You can check it on all the transcript. I'm not making a claim here. But whether you believe that or not, you whether believe the U.S. politicians or not, that's your matter. But I would just want to know what is your attitude, Matteo.
I share the analysis of my colleague in Washington. Overall, Europeans and Americans are coming together on a number of issues. The trend is positive for the two sides of the Atlantic in that respect. This has been a hiccup, as there are many, between long-term married couples, but the trend is positive. Now, how this will play out with other global players, as you said, it would take many hours to discuss.
Mr. Cui, your final words.
So I think it's give a very big question is once there are European countries and also United States always work together, especially when they are target some other countries. So there is no any necessary for United States to have this situation or this action towards European countries. Otherwise, it's just a show that there is not a trust from Washington towards the capitals in Europe.
We're running out of time, gentlemen, but I want to thank the three of you for coming over to our program and discuss and express your opinions from your own perspective. Really appreciate it. James Luis, Matteo Garavoglia, and Cui Hongjian, thank you so much for joining us. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching, and bye for now. Thanks.